It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't stop. I'd set up my camp earlier that day, hoping for a quiet night in the woods. My tent was small, just big enough for me and my stuff. The rain started off light, but by the time it got dark, it turned into a heavy downpour. At first, the sound of the rain hitting the tent felt nice, but after a few hours, I started to feel uneasy. The forest felt darker than usual. There was no moon, no stars, just the sound of the rain and the random rustling of the branches. I kept telling myself it was probably just the wind or some animals moving through the trees, but there was something off about the noise, like there was something else out there, hiding just outside the beam of my flashlight. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't stop myself from checking around the tent every so often. After a while, I heard something else. It was quiet, almost covered up by the rain, but I knew it was there. A crunching sound, like footsteps on wet leaves. It would stop, then start again, each time sounding like it was getting closer. I sat up and strained to listen, but it was hard to tell if I was actually hearing footsteps or if the rain was playing tricks on me. I didn't want to go out in the rain to check, but the more I listened, the harder it was to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The light cut through the rain, but all I could see was the soaked forest. No movement, no shapes, but the feeling that something was nearby didn't go away. I scanned the trees, hoping to catch sight of whatever was making the noise. My heart pounded as I pointed the light all around my campsite, expecting to see something standing there, but the only thing moving was the rain. I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just getting paranoid from being out here alone. But then the footsteps started again, louder this time, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was definitely out there, and it was close. Suddenly, the crunching stopped, and I heard something heavy brush up against the side of my tent. I froze. My mind raced, trying to figure out what could be out there. A bear? A deer? But it didn't feel like an animal. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was circling the tent. I didn't move. I barely breathed, waiting for it to leave. Minutes passed, but the rain kept beating down, making it hard to hear anything else. The footsteps stopped, and after a while I started to think it might be gone. Then, just when I was starting to relax, something yanked hard on the corner of my tent. The fabric stretched, and the stakes holding it down started to pull out of the ground. I scrambled backward, knocking over my stuff as the tent began to collapse. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what to do, but there wasn't time to think. Whatever was out there was trying to rip the tent apart. I grabbed my knife and pressed myself against the back of the tent. My eyes locked on the corner that had been pulled. The rain kept pounding, but all I could hear now was my own heavy breathing and the thudding of my heart. Whatever it was didn't pull again, though. After a long, tense moment, it seemed to back off. I stayed there, clutching my knife, for what felt like hours. The rain never stopped, and neither did the fear gnawing at me. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I knew something was still out there. It was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning finally came, the rain had slowed, and the forest looked peaceful, like nothing had happened. But the ground around my tent was a mess. The dirt was torn up, and there were muddy footprints leading away into the woods. I packed up as fast as I could and left without even thinking about breakfast. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. Even as I hiked out, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. I never figured out what was out there that night. No animal would have acted like that. Whatever it was smart. It didn't want food. It wasn't curious. It was testing me, pushing the boundaries. The thought of that still makes my skin crawl. I've camped a lot over the years, but I've never felt safe in the woods since. That night showed me that there's something out there, something real, that doesn't care if you see it or not. It's watching, it's waiting, and one day it's gonna come back. I agreed to go camping with my girlfriend and her boss, a man in his mid-60s, as a way for them to get to know each other better outside of work. The idea felt strange to me at first. Why would her boss want to spend a weekend in the woods with us? But my girlfriend said it would be a calm, nice weekend, and she mentioned that her boss was a kind and giving man. I figured it wouldn't be that bad. We'd spend a couple of nights in the woods, make s'mores, and relax. The drive to the campsite was long, and I kept thinking about how odd the whole thing was. A 65-year-old man going camping with a younger couple didn't seem right. Maybe I was just overthinking it, I told myself. He was nice enough, but there was something about him that seemed a little off. He smiled too much, and the way he watched my girlfriend when she wasn't paying attention made me feel uneasy. When we finally got to the spot he had chosen, it was deep in the woods, far from any other people. It was really quiet, too quiet. I didn't like it, but I tried to shake off the bad feeling. We set up our tents, had a small dinner, and settled in for the night. My girlfriend seemed happy, laughing at her boss's jokes like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't relax. I kept watching him, noticing the way he moved, the way his eyes stayed on us. By the second day, things started feeling even stranger. His behavior got weirder. He would wander off into the woods for hours and come back without saying where he'd been. He acted like it was no big deal, but it bothered me. One time, he left right after breakfast and didn't return until the sun was almost down. When I asked him where he'd been, he just smiled, that creepy, knowing smile, and said not to worry. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had this feeling deep in my gut that something was wrong. I kept trying to push it away, telling myself I was just being paranoid, that the quiet of the woods was messing with my head. But then I heard it, footsteps outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but the way the steps were slow and careful didn't sound like any animal I knew. They sounded like a person. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps circled the tent once, then again, slower this time. They stopped right behind where I was lying. I could hear breathing, deep and steady, like someone was standing just a few feet away. I reached for the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the footsteps started up again, this time moving around toward my girlfriend's side of the tent. My heart was racing. I didn't move. I waited, but nothing happened. Eventually, the steps faded away into the woods. The next morning, I told my girlfriend that we needed to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going on, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. But before we could pack up, her boss showed up again, smiling that same weird smile. He said we should stay another night, like he was planning something. The way he looked at us sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't trust him at all, but my girlfriend didn't seem as worried. She looked unsure, like she was caught between what I was saying and what her boss wanted. Later that day, when my girlfriend was distracted, I made up my mind. We were leaving. I didn't care if she got upset or if it seemed rude to her boss. We needed to get out of there. As I was packing up the last of our stuff, something caught my eye near the edge of the trees. It was a shoe, half buried in the dirt. It was old and dirty, the kind of shoe an older man might wear. It didn't look like it had been there long. My stomach turned. I grabbed my girlfriend and threw the rest of our things into the car. I didn't say a word to her boss as we drove off. As we pulled away, I saw him standing at the edge of the campsite, just watching us, with that same unsettling smile. The way he stood there, not even trying to stop us, felt even worse than if he had. It was like he knew something we didn't. When we finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The way he acted, the shoe in the woods, it all felt too strange to be a coincidence. A week later, I saw something on the news that made my blood run cold. A man had gone missing in the same area where we had camped. The police found one of his shoes near the woods, but they never found his body. That's when I realized that shoe I saw, it wasn't just random. It was his, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her boss had something to do with it. What scared me most was knowing that we had been so close to something terrible, and we barely got out. I still wonder what would have happened if we had stayed that extra night. I'm not sure if I want to know. I agreed to go on a camping trip with my boss, Sarah, and her 2 kids. Sarah wasn't just my boss. She was the type of person who always needed to be in control. I figured this trip would be no different, but I thought it'd be a good way to get out of the office and maybe get a break from work. We set up camp near an old mining area deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for years, and Sarah thought it would be fun for the kids, like an adventure. The weather was fine, and the woods were quiet, too quiet, actually. From the start, something about the place didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just because I wasn't used to being out in the wild. We spent most of the day hiking around and exploring the area. As the sun began to go down, that uneasy feeling came back. The old mining tunnels were everywhere, broken down and dark, with big open mouths that seemed to lead into nowhere. Sarah's kids kept getting too close to the edges, curious as kids are. The air felt strange around the tunnels, like it was heavier or thicker, and every step we took near one felt like the ground was warning us. We decided to head back to camp as it started getting dark. I tried to push away the feeling that something was wrong, but the woods felt darker than they should have been, even with the fire we had going. Every little noise in the distance made me jump. Sarah didn't seem bothered at all. She was always calm, like nothing could ever get to her. But I couldn't stop worrying about her kids. They kept wandering off, not staying close to the fire, even though we told them to. Night came quickly. The kids wanted to explore again, and Sarah let them go near the tunnels to keep them busy. I didn't think it was a good idea, but I wasn't the one making the decisions. I watched as the 2 of them ran off, their flashlights bouncing through the trees. We stayed by the fire, waiting for them to come back. Minutes passed, then more time. They didn't come back. I stood up, ready to go into the woods to find them. But Sarah didn't seem worried at all. She just sat there by the fire, as if nothing was wrong. Maybe she thought they were just playing or that they'd come back soon, but I had a bad feeling that something was off. I couldn't just sit there any longer. So I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the nearest tunnel. As I got closer, the light from my flashlight flickered over the entrance. I couldn't see much, just darkness stretching out in front of me. It looked like a deep, black hole in the ground. I called for them, but my voice just seemed to disappear into the tunnel, like the dark was swallowing it up. They had to be nearby, but I couldn't hear a thing. I stepped closer, and the ground under me felt like it was moving just a little. I stopped. The tunnel looked old, like it could collapse at any moment, but I knew I had to go in. The air inside was thick and stale. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight along the walls and the old tracks on the ground. The tunnel stretched on, and all I could hear was my own breathing. I kept calling their names, hoping I'd hear them, but the only answer I got was silence. The deeper I went, the more I felt like something was waiting for me in the dark, something that didn't want me there. Then I saw it, one of the kids' flashlights, lying on the ground. I rushed over, my heart pounding in my chest. The light was still on, but there was no sign of them, just emptiness all around me, and the tunnel stretching further into the dark. I didn't want to stay there any longer. The tunnel felt like it was closing in on me, like the walls were pressing in from all sides. I turned and ran back toward the entrance, my flashlight flickering as I went. The tunnel seemed longer on the way out, like it was trying to keep me inside. When I finally reached the opening, I saw Sarah still sitting by the fire, not moving. She hadn't even looked up. I tried to tell her that I couldn't find them, that something was wrong, but she just stared into the fire, like she hadn't heard a word I said. I looked back toward the woods, toward the tunnel where they disappeared, and that's when it hit me. Those tunnels were deeper than I had thought. Much deeper. We never found her kids. Rescue teams came and searched the tunnels for days, but there was no sign of them. No footprints, no clues, just that one flashlight I had found in the tunnel. The search was called off and the tunnels were closed off for good, marked as too dangerous. But I knew that wasn't the real reason. Those tunnels weren't just dangerous, they were something else entirely. Something that took people and didn't give them back. Sarah went back to work after the trip, acting like nothing had changed. But I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't the same. Neither was I. We never talked about what happened. No one did. But every night, I still hear the silence of that tunnel, the darkness that seemed alive. And I wonder if somewhere in those tunnels they're still there, just waiting. We planned a weekend camping trip. Just me, my stepbrother, and my gym buddy, Emily. The weather was great for October, cool enough to keep the bugs away, but not cold enough to make the night uncomfortable. We drove out to this quiet spot near a lake, far from the nearest town. It was remote, peaceful, just what we wanted. We found a small flat spot not too far from the lake. After setting up the tents, we gathered some wood for the fire. When the sun went down, the whole forest went silent. No wind, no birds, just the sound of our fire crackling. It wasn't the usual quiet you expect in the woods. It was like the whole forest had stopped moving. As it got darker, we sat around the fire, soaking in the quiet. Emily sat across from me, her face lit by the flames, while my stepbrother lay back, staring up at the stars. It was calming at first, maybe a bit too calm. But as I sat there, I started to feel like something wasn't right. The woods around us didn't feel normal. There weren't any sounds. No crickets, no rustling in the bushes. Nothing. It felt like the whole place had just emptied out. By the time we decided to sleep, I was already uneasy. When I got into my tent, I couldn't relax. Every little sound outside seemed louder than it should have been. Twigs snapping, leaves moving, everything sounded like it was right next to us. I tried to tell myself it was just the usual stuff you hear when you camp, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Sometime after midnight, I heard something different. Footsteps. They weren't heavy like an animal's, and they weren't quick like a squirrel or raccoon. They were slow, soft, but they had a human rhythm. Whoever it was, they were walking in circles around our campsite. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I opened my eyes wide in the dark, listening for any sign that my stepbrother or Emily had heard it too. But I heard nothing from their tents. Just the steady, slow steps outside going around and around. Time seemed to stretch. Every second felt like it was dragging on forever. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I stayed completely still, bracing myself, waiting for the tent flap to open. But nothing happened. No noise, no movement, just silence. Then the footsteps started again, moving away, back into the woods. I listened until they were too far to hear anymore. The next morning, nobody mentioned it, but I could see it in their faces. Neither Emily nor my stepbrother had slept much either. We packed up quickly, not really talking, and headed out sooner than we had planned. When we got home, I noticed something strange. As I was unpacking the gear, I found something that didn't belong to any of us. It was a small, crudely made wooden figure, carved to look like a person. It looked old and rough, like someone had made it by hand. I knew none of us had brought it, I threw it away right then and there, hoping to forget it, but the feeling stayed with me. I thought that would be the end of it, but then weird things started happening at home. I'd hear the same footsteps, soft and slow, pacing around my house at night. They always stopped outside my bedroom door. Then, the next morning, I found the same wooden figure I had thrown out. It was sitting right on my windowsill, staring into my room. Whoever or whatever had left it behind knew where I lived now, and I don't think they're going away. I went camping alone for the first time in a long time, just wanting some quiet away from the noise of everyday life. I found a nice, peaceful spot near the woods, far from the nearest town. It seemed perfect, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the fire I had going. I had my tent set up, and as the sun went down, I felt good about being out here, surrounded by nothing but nature. The place was quiet. Too quiet. Usually you hear animals in the bushes or at least birds, but not that night. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like something's not right, but I just told myself I was being paranoid. As it got darker, I noticed someone else camping about 50 yards away. He was setting up his tent. Earlier, he waved at me when he got there, and I waved back, though we didn't talk. He looked like he was in his late 50s, strong and solidly built, with the way he moved making me think he was ex-military. It reminded me of some of the guys I knew from my time in the army. By the time night fell, I was sitting by my fire, having something to eat, when I noticed him walking around his camp in an odd way. It wasn't like he was just strolling. He was moving with purpose, like he was on a patrol. He kept looking around, checking everything like he was expecting trouble. I figured he was just being overly careful, but it didn't sit well with me. Later, when I lay down in my tent to sleep, I started hearing footsteps. Slow, steady steps coming from his campsite. I thought maybe he was just restless, walking around his camp. But then, the footsteps got closer to my tent. I froze, wondering if he needed help or something. The footsteps stopped just outside my camp. I held my breath, listening, but nothing happened. No movement, just silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The back of my neck tingled. I carefully unzipped my tent a little and peeked outside. There, about 20 feet away, stood the man. He was facing the woods, standing completely still. He didn't seem to know I was watching him. For several minutes, he just stood there, staring into the trees, like he was waiting for something. Then, without a sound, he walked into the woods, slowly but deliberately. I didn't know what to think. Maybe he was just going for a late-night walk, but the way he moved, the fact that he made no sound at all, gave me a bad feeling. I stayed in my tent, watching, and decided not to move, keeping my eyes open, unsure of what was happening. About an hour went by. I started hearing the normal sounds of the forest again. Crickets, a few rustles in the bushes, even an owl in the distance. The quietness from earlier was gone, and I started to relax a little. I told myself that the guy was probably just wandering around and that I was overthinking it. But then, I heard something else from his camp. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart raced. I got out of my tent, crouching low, and moved toward his campsite. As I got closer, a cold chill ran through me. The man had come back, but he wasn't alone. He had dragged something with him, something large and wrapped in what looked like a tarp. Too big to be firewood or anything else you'd normally bring camping. He was crouched over it, doing something I couldn't quite see. But I knew right then that I didn't want to know what was inside that tarp. My mind raced. Who was this guy? What had he done? I backed away slowly, not making a sound, and returned to my tent. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't let him know I had seen anything. I packed my stuff as quietly as I could, heart pounding the entire time. I didn't stick around to see what else he was up to. I grabbed my gear, left my fire burning, and slipped into the woods, staying off the trail so he wouldn't see me. I walked fast but quietly, not stopping until I reached my car, far enough away that I felt somewhat safer. Even then, I didn't stop until I had driven miles down the road. I never went back to that campsite, and I never reported what I saw. Whatever he was doing that night, I didn't want to get involved. But I still think about it, about what could have been in that tarp, and why he was so calm, so methodical about everything. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I wonder if he noticed me watching him. Maybe he's still out there watching someone else, waiting. I was camping alone in a quiet part of the forest, far from the sounds of the city. I really needed a break, so I packed my gear and set up my tent near a small creek. The sun was going down, casting long shadows among the trees, and the sounds of nature filled the air. I felt relaxed as I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker. As night fell, I heard something strange, a rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as the noise continued, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I stood up and shone my flashlight into the darkness. My heart raced when I noticed something odd between the trees. I walked closer, curiosity pulling me in. When I got to the spot, my stomach dropped. There, half hidden by leaves and dirt, was what looked like a body. It was face down, completely still. I froze, my mind racing. It had to be a prank or a sick joke, but deep down, I knew it was real. The smell of decay hit me hard, and I stumbled back, feeling sick. My heart pounded loudly in my ears. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to get out of there. I hurried back to my tent, shaking all over. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. What had happened here? Who was that person? My gut screamed at me to leave the forest as quickly as I could. I packed my things in a panic, barely able to think straight. With my tent rolled up and my gear packed, I jumped into my car. I was terrified, unsure if someone else was out there, hiding in the dark. I drove away, taking the winding road as fast as I could. The forest felt alive around me, shadows dancing in my headlights. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something behind me, something that didn't belong. As I reached the main road, I finally felt a wave of relief. I turned on my phone, ready to call the police. I reported the body I'd found, still shaking. They said they would send someone out to check it out, but I could already picture the scene in my mind. It was too late to help that person, but I needed to make sure no one else would stumble upon it in the dark. Days later, I learned from the news that the police had connected my discovery to a missing person case. The body had been there for weeks, and it made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked through something terrible, something I should never have seen. Now, every time I think about camping, I feel a knot form in my stomach. I can still picture that body lying there, and it haunts my thoughts. I wonder what kind of monster could do something like that. The forest that once felt peaceful now feels like a place of secrets, hiding dangers in its shadows. And as I lie awake at night, I can't help but think, what if I had stayed just a little longer? What if I wasn't alone out there? The thought chills me to the bone, making me feel like I'm still being watched by eyes that don't belong in the woods. In the summer of 1989, I took a break from my job as a security guard to go camping in the nearby woods. Those woods had always been a peaceful spot for me, filled with tall trees and the sounds of birds. I was feeling worn out from my long shifts, so a weekend away sounded perfect. I packed my gear, grabbed some food, and headed to a small clearing I had found on a previous hike. As I set up my tent, I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of nature felt strangely muted, but I brushed it off as just my imagination. After I finished, I built a small fire and sat down to enjoy the evening. The sun was setting, casting a warm light through the trees. But as darkness crept in, the mood changed. The lively sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by a heavy silence. Even the wind felt like it had stopped. I spent the night by the fire watching the flames flicker. Hours went by, and I started to feel the weight of the darkness closing in on me. I looked at my watch. It was well past midnight. Just as I was about to go to bed, I heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes nearby. My heart raced. I pointed my flashlight at the noise, but there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and crawled into my tent. The fabric felt thin against the chill, so I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me. Lying there, trying to fall asleep, the rustling continued. It wasn't constant, but it would come and go. Sometimes it was close, and other times it felt far away. Each sound sent shivers down my spine. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, waking up often to the sounds outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, crunching through the leaves. I peeked out of my tent, but the darkness swallowed everything. I felt so exposed and vulnerable, lying there in my flimsy shelter. The next morning, I woke up feeling completely drained. The sun was shining, but I was still on edge. I made breakfast and decided to pack up early. I just wanted to leave the woods behind. As I took down my tent, I noticed something strange in the dirt where I had camped. Footprints. They were much bigger than my own, deep marks in the ground. I couldn't shake the feeling that they had been there during the night, circling my tent. Panic set in. I hurried to gather my gear, the rustling from the night before echoing in my mind. As I finished packing, I took one last look around the clearing. That's when I spotted it. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it belonged to an old jacket. I swallowed hard, chills running down my spine. Someone had been out here, and it wasn't just some animal. I didn't want to stick around any longer. I took off in the direction of the trail, my heart racing. Every snap of a twig felt like a warning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The feeling of dread followed me until I finally reached my car. I threw my gear in the back seat and drove away, the woods shrinking in my rearview mirror. As I drove, the sun brightened, but the fear didn't fade. I knew I had escaped whatever was out there, but the thought of those footprints haunted me. I could feel the weight of the woods behind me, hiding something I couldn't understand. That camping trip was supposed to be a break, but it turned into a nightmare. Sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. I drove faster, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being followed. The road twisted and turned, and each bump in the pavement made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints from my mind. Who had left them, and why did they feel like they were waiting for me to fall asleep, just to come closer? When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. I took a deep breath, thinking I was safe. But as I glanced at my side mirror, I froze. In the distance, where the trees met the road, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me drive away. It was too far to see clearly, but the outline felt all too familiar. I sped up, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knowing I would never return to those woods. They were not just a place of peace anymore. They were a reminder that some places are better left alone, hiding the darkest truths in the shadows. The fear crept in again, settling deep in my gut, reminding me that not all who wander in the woods come out again.